Welcome back, everybody. I am here speaking to Mr. Ray Bassett, who is a diplomat and an ambassador to Canada, and we're going to be talking about Brexit and the implications that it has for Ireland. So it's very good to be with you, Ray.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much for the invitation.
So obviously, whether one is a Eurosceptic or very pro-EU, I think it's kind of undeniable at this stage that the border issues that have been created by Brexit are serious and they're very complicated and they're difficult to manage. Do you think that because of all of the chaos that's taken place since Brexit, do you think that this has weakened the case for Brexit, or do you think it's strengthened it?
I think, on the island of Ireland, it certainly coloured our views on Brexit. But I think in Britain, sadly in some ways, the border between the Republic and Northern Ireland was very much a sideshow, and I don't think it moved many people one way or the other. The real tragedy of it was that nobody was talking about putting a border on the island of Ireland except the European Union, and all the protocol and all the negotiations were really about asking Britain to do things which would alleviate the EU from its desire to protect the single market, in other words, erect a border. So the government and generally the Irish establishment built up a straw man as that they were going to defend that there be no border on the island of Ireland. But then the British government had said from day one that they had no intention of erecting a border, and it's not in their interest to erect a border. So, in many ways, this business where we were all very, and rightly so, against the border on the island of Ireland, we were getting it, I think, from the wrong angle. The wrong angle was that the British were going to put a border up. The British never said they were going to put a border. In fact, they lost 1,000 members of the security forces in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. It cost them billions. And the last thing they were going to try and do was re-establish the border. If the border was re-established, it was to safeguard the single market. Nothing to do with, respect for Irish nationalism or, respect for a unitary state here in the island of Ireland.
Well, that may be true, but do you not agree that the border has to be somewhere? I mean, we are dealing with two different jurisdictions now. There doesn't need to be a customs barrier somewhere, and I mean that's obviously the whole debate. From the perspective of the European Union, you can understand why this is such a difficult position for them.
I think there's truth in that, but I also think that, given the circumstances in Ireland, what we needed was basically a boutique or a unique solution to a unique problem. It's not the same as the border between Belarus and Lithuania. It just isn't, so you can't treat it like that. And the European Union and the British haven't covered themselves in glory on this issue. Now, I would have preferred a much loose, I mean, as you know, Ben, I would have preferred Ireland to essentially go its own way and to leave the European Union. That's not going to happen in the immediate future. But I think we should have, on the European side, been prepared to initiate, to agree to arrangements on the island of Ireland between Ireland and Britain, which the European Union had never agreed before, simply because nobody, apart from Greenland, had left the European Union. No countries are as close as Ireland and Britain. No country is divided like Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So there should have been a solution which, broke out of the rigid frameworks that the European Union were trying to put on the issue.
So what would be your proposed solution? Obviously, I'm sure it would be very complicated and difficult to outline, but kind of in a condensed version, if you were advising the governments involved, how do you think that you would?
Well, I think we should have started off on the basis, and maybe this is because I was at the Good Friday negotiations, was part of the Irish government team, that we should have treated both communities in Northern Ireland equally. So you sort of say, if there's going to be pain, let it be shared, because I think one of the reasons for the problem with the protocol is the perception in the unionist community of being shafted, and to some extent, and that's true. I would have preferred that we created a situation where the need for checks will be very minimised by an operation of a trusted trader system. For instance, all the big companies should essentially give returns. And secondly, I wouldn't have been totally opposed to some checking of cargo between the Republic of Ireland and the European mainland. Because remember, the vast bulk of Irish goods by volume goes through the United Kingdom, and they're going to have to be checked now anyway. So it's only a small proportion go directly from on the Le Havre, Rosslare or route. So I would have been prepared. I wouldn't have put down a marker early on and said, no, there can be no checks on this. I think we should have, in order to facilitate freer trade in the island of Ireland, we should have been said that the European Union should make spot checks to make sure that people weren't using the Republic of Ireland as a backdoor into the European Union. And also the British could do spot checks on any goods coming through the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland. I think we should have sat down with a joint committee and joint manager. A big problem, and I wrote about it at the time, was the first day that the European Union came out that said that any arrangements on the island of Ireland must not infringe the European legal order. When we accepted that, we essentially were going down a cul-de-sac, and we're in that cul-de-sac. And to be quite honest, the British will never implement the protocol in the way that the European Union wanted. So I think both sides need to compromise.
You mentioned earlier the idea that a customs border could be put between Ireland and the rest of the European Union, the Republic of Ireland and the rest of the EU, which I heard that was proposed earlier this year, and the EU were adamant that they would never do anything like that because it would effectively, in a small way, almost be like kicking Ireland out of the bloc, which would be a radical thing to do. But do you think that because of the hassle that's involved in all of these border issues, that something like that would be possible, that they could effectively just say, look, Ireland, for the greater good of the overall entity, you're just going to have to bite the bullet?
Well, Ben, I'm coming from a particular standpoint where I would like to see that, so you tend to rationalise your own position. But my understanding was that some people in Germany looking at it, and the Germans said quite rationally, if the bulk of goods are going through Britain and we want to keep the border open, why not do it? And the Irish government rejected it very, very strongly. And there are valid reasons for them doing it, but I don't think those valid reasons override the threat to peace and the need for us to maintain. I mean, I'm an Irish nationalist. I want my grandchildren live in Belfast. Half my family are in the north. I don't want to see anything between north and south. That's probably very, very important to me. And I'm prepared to, sacrifice some of the Euro-federalist dreams for that. For that. And I think that we need to be much more flexible. Now, to be quite honest, Micheál Martin has shown a much greater degree of flexibility than Leo Varadkar. And so all the rhetoric has toned down, and we're going to understand now that punishing Britain is not a good idea for Ireland. It just isn't. And the earlier sort of strident noises made by Leo Varadkar and Simon Coveney were counterproductive, and they also had a bad effect on Britain in that the moderate sections of the Conservative Party, from a European standpoint, were discredited by our failure to compromise with them.
So pivoting then to the UK and the success of Brexit, or the failure, depending on your perspective, UK Trade Secretary Liz Truss has said that within the first few months of Brexit becoming official, the UK had signed something like €1 trillion worth of trade deals with 67 countries all around the world. That figure has probably grown by now. And, when you look at the media, it's obviously, we only hear the doom and gloom, the apocalyptic scaremongering about how Brexit has been catastrophic for the UK. And so we're hearing something totally different from UK officials. So what I'm wondering is, where is the truth of this matter? Do you think that it's been good for the UK trade-wise, or has it harmed them?
I think in the long run it'll be good for the UK trade-wise. The European Union is the slowest growing area in the world, essentially, economically. And the dire predictions that Britain would be under the floor and massive recession, and Nissan would pull out and everything, haven't proved true. On the other hand, some of the wild kind of expectations of the Brexiteers had not been met. What the British did was, on the trade deals, they did something very simple. They flipped over almost all the trade deals that the European Union had with our country, which people said you couldn't do. I remember people saying, take 10 years. Now they've started they've started to negotiate specific trade deals, very different from the European Union, and it's very, very dangerous for Ireland because, you know, I've written about this, that the only reason Ireland joined the European EEC was to safeguard our cattle trade. I mean, it's right in the archives. Ireland had no interest in the European EEC in the 1950s. It was only in 1961 when the discovered Britain had applied. In the words of the Secretary General of the Department of Finance, T.K. Whitaker, it would have been catastrophic for Ireland not to be able to export cattle and food products to the United Kingdom. And that's the reason we applied. And they sat down deliberately and told the government, you have to be pro-European. There wasn't any sort of indigenous or, you know, spontaneous outburst of pro-European. It was, we have very little to offer this EEC. They're not particularly care whether we join or not. So the way we go over, we tell everybody in Europe that we're great Europeans. And that got into the DNA, and people seem to be going on about it. But that was the reason we did it. Now, the British have just signed a trade deal with Australia, which is very different than any other trade deal. It will almost certainly bring in Australian beef. And our beef will not compete with, you know, South American beef, with New Zealand beef, with Australian beef. And that will be a major blow to rural Ireland. Now, we could have had a much better arrangement with the United Kingdom if we had played footsie with Cameron or with Theresa May. The fact that we wouldn't compromise, or that we compromised far too late and we were so antagonistic, essentially destroyed their credibility within the Tory party. And what happened is we then get Boris Johnson, who really doesn't care about Ireland, and Liz Truss, who are quite prepared to sign deals that will destroy our beef industry. Remember, half of all the beef raised in Ireland goes to the United Kingdom. It's starting to fall, 280,000 tonnes. We were supplying 70% of all British imports of beef at one stage. And we should have thought of that when we were driving a wedge into the British, when Simon Coveney was telling them that, you know, we are now the stronger partner. You've got to sue for kind of peace with us. I think it was so counterproductive, and it's going to cause huge damage. And I think in retrospect, the activity of the Irish state during Brexit will be regarded as a major own goal historically.
Do you think there's any way to reverse it if we got our act together? Is there anything we can do to slow the bleeding or minimise the damage?
I think there is. I think Micheál Martin has started it to some extent. He has stopped the attacks. Now, the first thing is, Bill Shankly used to say the game starts 0-0, don't make it any worse. So the first thing he always advised government, don't make it worse. I think, you know, I'm always amazed in Britain at the level of goodwill towards Ireland, even when we kick them. You know, when we're watching a football match, and every one of us is up for Hong Kong if they're playing, England, and yet the English have a ton. I think we need to mend relations with, and I think, you know, the fact that the Cabinet Secretary, the head of the Civil Services, is to be the new ambassador to London shows that the government know that, and they've put a very senior person in there. We need to rebuild that, and I think, you know, there is a fount of goodwill, but we've done a lot of damage, there's no doubt about that, over the last 2 years. And all for what? We've ended up with a government in London which are going for a very strong Brexit, breaking the links, and have no intention of playing the European Union's game. So if you were setting out with that objective, you would regard it as very foolish. But the results of our action helped to bring that about.
Obviously, we're looking at the rise of Sinn Fein in many ways. At the last election, they had a phenomenal showing for them historically, and they seem to be on the rise. You know, we'll see how things pan out. But assuming that trajectory continues, and if, you know, maybe in a couple of years we ended up with a Sinn Fein government, how do you think that would affect Anglo-Irish relations and all of these issues that we're talking about?
I think people would adopt. It wouldn't be good because, again, Sinn Fein has a legacy in relationships with Britain. I think in some ways that's the negative. The positive is that Sinn Fein is probably the most Eurocritical party, and I believe that their support for Europe was essentially a political decision, not a psychological decision. And they are still talking about that, you know, resisting any further transfers of powers and things like that. So they might, you know, in a post-Brexit world, they might be actually more of a help to the British. But, you know, to be honest with you, I doubt it. I remember talking to a very senior Sinn Fein person and say about their change from being Eurosceptical to what they call Eurocritical. And he said, look, whilst there's a row on between Brussels and London, you'll never get Sinn Fein to support London. You know, it's almost down because we're viscerally anti-British. And, you know, so maybe when all this is over, Sinn Féin will start rethinking its own philosophy, which it followed for decades, and only switched to a pro-European policy, I think, to try and court favour with the electorate in the Republic.
I mean, Sinn Féin ourselves alone, it doesn't really lend oneself to, you know, being governed by a foreign bureaucracy.
I spoke at Féile, which is in Belfast, which is the biggest festival in Ireland, but it's a sort of community festival. And I said, you know, I actually believe the European Union is serious when it says it wants a European state. And everything they do shows in that direction. I don't believe this business that we're into shared sovereignty and you can take it back when you want to. And I mean, it's quite clear. Every document they have, every policy is geared towards creation of a single state. Now, I happen to be, as I said earlier, Ben, an Irish nationalist. I want an independent state here, which cooperates very closely with its European neighbours and its North American neighbours and the world community, but maintains in the end its own democracy, which we don't have really at the moment with the European Union, and its own ability to say yes or no.
Well, pivoting then back to the UK, obviously I think it's hard to deny that immigration was one of the big motivating factors for Brexit, and why so many people voted for it was to regain control of the UK's borders. But now we're hearing reports that things like illegal immigration, illegal border channel crossings are at an all-time high under people like Priti Patel, who are talking, you know, they're saying all of these strong things and the rhetoric is there, but it doesn't seem like the UK's Tory government is backing up all of the promises that were made. Do you think that Brexit voters are getting what they asked for when they voted in that referendum in 2016?
Yes and no. I think immigration is still very high in the United Kingdom, and they're against it. A lot of the people weren't against well, let's say the leaders of the Brexit movement weren't against immigration. What they were against was uncontrolled immigration. In other words, the United Kingdom should have a say on who's coming in here. And if you're from Australia or the United States or Canada, and you have huge connections with a country, you should be on an equal basis with everybody. It shouldn't be that, you know, people from Croatia, from Poland get preference to them. On the illegal migration, it's very difficult for a country to actually control that if they're coming over in boats. I mean, if you don't sink them, what do you do? I can see that the UK have put 50 million over to France to try and stop them. I mean, the French should stop them coming over. But that sort of immigration creates fears within a community that the place is being overrun. And the British government will have to get on top of it if they're going to, you know, maintain their credibility on the immigration issue. But what they want to do, you know, nobody sort of says that Australia and Canada, the United States, has a particularly racist immigration policy. But if you say you want to leave the European Union and you want to have a points-based system of immigration based on skills or based on need, then you're beyond the pale. And it's part of this business that if you move away from the main establishment lines, you're tarred with this brush that, you know, you can't. There's a certain framework that you have to stay within, and if you try and break out that framework, you're beyond the pale.
Absolutely. So if people want to read more about your thoughts on this, I believe you recently wrote a book on the subject of the European Union.
That was an interesting experience. I wrote a book called Ireland and the EU Post-Brexit, and I got endorsements from some very senior people, Tim Pat Coogan, Yale University, Pat McGart, who's a former editor of the Derry Journal, and I went to every publisher in the Republic of Ireland and in the North and asked them to publish it, and I was told no. And, that's everybody's right. But Tim Pat Coogan spoke to several publishers and they said, oh, this book is very well worth publishing, but we're not publishing it because you're putting yourself in a position there that we might find uncomfortable with the authorities. So I had to go across the water to publish. It's done very well. The average Irish book sells about 200. We're now at 2,000, and that without any paper in the Republic of Ireland previewing it. Now all the papers in Belfast did, and the British papers did, but it just shows you how much. And I went and spoke to the Irish Times. I spoke to the Independent, and gave them the books. I said, if you're selling 2,000 books and it's from a very, very different point of view than the mainstream, maybe it'd be worth a line or two. And the paper I used to write for myself, the Sunday, it's now called the Business Post, I gave it to them and I thought they were going to do it, but then they backed out of it as well. So, in the end, it meant that the sales were much more heavily in Britain than they were in Ireland. But, that's life. And, if you can go around whinging or you can do something about it and go around their obstacles.
Most definitely. Well, thank you so much, Ray. It was really good to speak to you.